11:01. Hello, folks. Looks like we're live on the Bradley J Show. I'm so excited to not be sick with COVID.
Awesome.
It's good. Rich, this is our guest, Rich Rubino, political analyst and historian. Rich, did you ever get COVID?
No, actually, I'm one of the few people that, to my knowledge, has not gotten it.
Well, at some point you probably will. It's not a lot of fun, but you'll survive. So, Rich wants to, and I want to talk about the surprising fact that there are areas where the right and the left agree. They agree in two ways. They agree when the extremes are so extreme they meet in the middle, and then there's also the way to agree when the moderate right and the moderate left agree. And I think it might be healthy and healing to talk about what those things are. So there
Yeah.
you go.
Yes.
Well,
Yeah.
where do you want to start?
It's
Rich?
fascinating because politics is not a continuum. You don't just keep going to the far right and far left and keep going and going and going. It's almost like a circle or a horseshoe. Eventually, you come to a point where you connect, and the far left and the far right often work together. And the reason I mention this is you see this, for example, on support for repealing the authorization of use of force for going back for Iraq, going back to the Gulf War, and going back to 2002 that they gave respectively to both Bushes. You have this scenario where you have some of the most conservative members of the House of Representatives, like Chip Roy from Texas, who's one of those who opposed Kevin McCarthy for Speaker. And then you have Barbara Lee from California, who is the only member of the House of Representatives who actually voted against the authorization of the use of force in Afghanistan after 9/11, and literally had to have a security detail. So they're working together. You hear about the Progressive Caucus. That's essentially AOC. That's Jared Bowen. That's members of the Squad. And then there is the Freedom Caucus, which you heard for their opposition to Kevin McCarthy. They work together on a lot of issues in terms of foreign policy. And it's fascinating because I think you've got the scenario in America where you have the far right and the far left often agreeing, and as I've said before, where Pat Buchanan's Mercedes rams right into Ralph Nader's bicycle. The opposition to NAFTA, for example, you have Jesse Helms, the most conservative senator from North Carolina, very much opposed to it. You had Congressman Bernie Sanders opposed to it. Then you have Pat Buchanan, Ralph Nader opposed to it, Dick Gephardt. And how did it get through? It got through because Bill Clinton, a center-left Democrat, worked with Bob Dole, a center-right Republican, and they got it through with more Republican than Democrat votes. But essentially, you had the center-right and the center-left working against the far right and the far left. By the way, every living former president supported NAFTA. I don't know about the dead presidents, but we can't really get to them. But it's just such a fascinating scenario where you have in politics right now. You often hear someone on the far left or far right running, and some might say, well, you're not going to be able to work with your colleagues. You're not going to be able to work bipartisanly. Well, actually, they are. It's just a matter of working on the extremes. And sometimes Bernie Sanders, for example, is known as the Amendment King. He's worked with Josh Hawley. Elizabeth Warren has worked with Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley is maybe the most conservative senator, and he's from Missouri. They've worked, for example, on banking issues. They've worked on trying to get another stimulus check passed. For example, Ron Paul, very conservative, almost libertarian congressman. When it comes to foreign policy, he was working with Dennis Kucinich, very liberal congressman. So it's really an interesting scenario.
So where does Marjorie Taylor Greene fit in here? She doesn't seem to fit in to me. Because, I mean, there's people who
she does.
They have policy, but then there's straight up crazy. And she seems to be the result of the result of straight up crazy. And so she's kind of flat Earth. There are flat Earth societies which actually promote flat Earth, even though they really know that the Earth is not flat. They do it because it's an identity. It's a way to break through on social media. Where does she fall in? She says things like, she's, what was it? It's something about aliens and, her past.
Yeah. She said that that the Jewish people were using space lasers to start wildfires. That was one of back in.
So can't you just dismiss her? Really? Come on.
No, you can't. Well, first of all, the Flat Earth Society, they're not just kind of a hobby horse. They actually have meetings, and they will actually pay money. They went to Colorado one year, every year just about, and they actually have meetings where they have panel discussions.
But
Where
having
they,
meetings and having panels doesn't make them not nuts.
oh, they may be nuts. I'm just saying I'm just saying these are people who I think actually legitimately believe the Earth is flat. I don't think they're just doing this for an affinity group. There may be,
I don't believe it.
you don't think
Actually,
they
they're
actually
doing
believe?
it because they love the hobby of arguing the case. And it's their
Maybe.
identity. It gets them to stand out.
It's no, it does that, and that's the same thing, by the way, with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Think about Marjorie Taylor Greene. She's literally a sophomore congressperson. Okay, she's a sophomore congressperson. She's on two powerful committees. She's on the Homeland Security Committee and she's on the Oversight Committee. But there are a lot of other members of those committees as well that you've never heard of. She's not in any position of leadership. She's not the chairman of a committee. She's not the chairman of a subcommittee. The only reason why she's nearly a household word is because of what she said in the past, and because members of the media absolutely love to cover her because she's essentially good copy.
All right. Shame on the media. Shame, shame, shame.
Let me ask
them.
you this question. How many people know who Steny Hoyer is?
Not a lot.
Steny Hoyer in the last few Congresses was the number 2 man, the majority leader to Nancy Pelosi. Steny Hoyer, yes. Steny Hoyer, very few people knew who he actually was. Or on the Republican side, how many people know who Steve Scalise is, or Gary Palmer, or other members of the Republican leadership? These are people
Your point is, yeah, okay.
These are people who actually have power to accomplish something. Marjorie Taylor Greene, she actually does have power now in terms of influence, because she comes out and she essentially says something, and what happens? Essentially, she has a litany of adherents, and those followers who essentially will just about go to the end of earth for her. Will lobby their congressman.
The ends of the earth, meaning the earth is flat because it has an end.
Yes, and then the people fall off at the end, though, and that's why you never hear. That's why you never hear from them. That's why you never hear, because they fall off.
Again, shame on the media. So triple heaping doses of stinking shame that they cover Marjorie Taylor Greene instead of Steny Hoyer. We should know who Steny Hoyer is, and it's the media that makes it possible and makes it profitable for Marjorie Taylor Greene to say crazy crap.
Well, also the fact that Donald Trump, I think, kind of made her. All of a sudden, she was a freshman congresswoman, and she's speaking at his rallies, in part because she heaps a lot of praise on Donald Trump. When Donald Trump went to Mar-a-Lago, Donald Trump went to Mar-a-Lago after his indictment, you saw all the people there. You saw Matt Gaetz and Marjorie Taylor Greene, representing the United States Congress, were there walking out right before the My Pillow guy. So now in the actual United States Congress, she has not filed a major piece of legislation that's gotten passed. Now, in fairness, that's true for most members of Congress. Congress is very much a collaborative body, and it's a huge misnomer. Someone will run against someone and say, in 16 years, this guy's only authored one bill that's gotten passed. Well, that would be true, but they also have offered amendments. They've offered amendments to bills. But in the case of Marjorie Taylor Greene, in terms of what she's done for the state of Georgia, what she's done for her district versus just simply getting national media attention.
Right. What's she done?
That's what I'm saying. She was asked this question in a debate when she was running for re-election. Her opponent says, essentially, what have you done for the district? And her answer was, well, I brought grants. Well, that's true. And every congressman has brought grants to their district. And you see, for example, if there's a huge stimulus package, even people who vote against it sometimes will go to a press conference to announce, we just got, $3 million that can go to this new wing for the community college or something, and essentially take credit. So yes, she did do that, but that's also something that every congressman does. Now, in terms of constituent service, that's something every congressman does. Obviously, they have staffs, but certainly if, for example, you've lost a Social Security check, or if you have you've had
passport,
anything like that, or you want to enter the congressional art competition, you want to be nominated for a military academy, you want a flag to fly over the Capitol, you want it to fly over. You want to have the flag for yourself. That's stuff that congressional staffs essentially do, but that's essentially something that every congressional staff does. But usually, if you have some sort of an interest and you have some sort of an issue, maybe it's trying to get Section 8 vouchers, whatever it is, you call the congressman's staff, and usually they are very amenable to helping you in that circumstance. And when they do help you, that congresswoman or congresswoman, despite contrary to what their ideology is, you probably have a voter and maybe 10 or 11 voters and their friends for life if you've really helped somebody.
Right. So is she going to get reelected?
Oh yeah, she'll be reelected. Yes.
And why? She's not doing really much for her constituents.
Because she represents she represents Northwest Georgia. It goes all the way from the Tennessee border down to the point where it's about 45 minutes from the Atlanta border. One of the most conservative districts in the country. This is Rome, Georgia. This is Athens, Georgia. I guess there's kind of a Greek phenomenon there, I guess. This is one of the most conservative districts in the country. And
I'm surprised Athens is conservative because it's a college town.
It is a college town, and it's also it's also Fulton, Georgia's there, which is the furniture capital of the world. Which has some union members as well. But there's also it's kind of like Kevin McCarthy's district. In Kevin McCarthy's district, you have obviously there's a city in Bakersfield. There's some liberal areas, but then once you get on the outskirts and you get outside of Bakersfield, it becomes very conservative very fast, and it's very similar in Marjorie Taylor Greene. But the point is that district, you could pretty much put up just about anybody who has not been in jail for more than 10 years if they have a Republican as their name if they have a Republican next to their name, they are going to be the congressman from Northwest Georgia. It's one of the most conservative places in the country.
So look, something's wrong with the system if a Taylor Greene can thrive. And young people look at this. When they poll young people, they say that democracy is not that important to them. And one of the reasons is this democracy allows moron head Green to thrive. You can understand why they're saying this is not that great.
I can immediately hear people on the libertarian right as soon as you said that saying constitutional republic, which is true, but it's a form of democracy. But I just want to say that because I can see
right. Okay, whatever we call this thing that we have.
People writing. I can see
maybe we should go to full-on democracy because there's something in the system. If it allows a person whose platform who believes and has said the Jewish folks are shooting space lasers to start forest fires, thrives. And she said worse and dumber stuff. And Boebert, I saw Boebert the other day talking about how the government should be subservient to religion.
Right.
And was intended to be that way. And completely ignoring the efforts to separate church and state. Why this unreasonableness is supported, and this maybe it's the media. It's like shame on Fox, shame on MSNBC, shame on it for covering this Trump thing so much. Come on,
It's interesting in terms of Boebert because she's actually a different animal than Marjorie Taylor Greene. Her district, she actually won in a Republican primary against essentially a center-right Republican that she called a rhino. A rhino is a pejorative term that conservatives use for Republicans in name only. Democrats do the same. They call Dino, someone like Joe Manchin, Democrat in name only. So she won a primary, and when win a primary in a conservative part of the country in Colorado, she represents the area. It actually goes to some liberal areas of Aspen, but then it goes all the way up to the more conservative parts like Grand Junction. So it's kind of an interesting district. But when she ran for re-election last time, Donald Trump wins the district by about 9 points. She wins by less than 1,000 votes. It took 3 weeks for the election to be litigated. That was the second closest election in the entire country, and she was underperforming in terms of Donald Trump. So she is kind of an anomaly, and she does not represent a district that is ruby red, as does Marjorie Taylor Greene. And she's somebody actually who could lose. Colorado, I'll just say this, Colorado's a really weird state. You have very liberal members, and you have Doug Lamburn, maybe the most conservative member, who represents around Colorado Springs. And then you have Lori Boebert, one of the most conservative members. But you also have Denver, and you have Aspen, and you have Vail, and of course you have Boulder, not exactly a citadel of conservatism.
No, I don't know whether she's really that dumb. Those that just say she's dumb, or that she manufactures this stuff. But I myself have doubts about the system if a Boebert and a Marjorie Taylor Greene can thrive, or if they're equivalents on the left.
Well,
Just
there's always been this scenario. You got to remember, and actually Ross Perot did talk about the idea of actually having electronic town halls when he ran in 1992, where American people could actually vote yes or no on a piece of legislation. Now, my guess is the American people don't have the time to actually study the pieces of legislation, everything that goes through to study the intricacies of the Farm Bill, for example. So that's why essentially you elect somebody else to represent you. But you have 435 voting members and then 5 non-voting delegates. And essentially, when you split the country up into 435 districts, and by the way, you also allow the states you allow the state legislatures to essentially gerrymander or pick their districts, and then the Congress. So essentially, whichever party is in power, if a party has an overwhelming majority, Democrat or Republican, they're going to do everything they possibly can to benefit a congressman from their party so that their district has as many voters from their party as possible. But 435 congressional districts, eventually you're going to get some extremists.
isn't gerrymandering obviously a form of corruption?
Yes, it is. It's interesting. This actually came so Elbridge Gerry, and his actual name is Gary, not Jerry. So Elbridge Gerry was governor of Massachusetts. He was a Democratic Republican. He signed the legislation essentially to benefit the Democratic Republican Party. So his name's been attributed to it, even though this was kind of a passive thing he signed. It wasn't his major flagship issue. Eventually became vice president. But essentially, yes, it allows the politicians to pick their constituents.
I don't want to get too far off whack here, but I guess I've gone down the rabbit hole of the corruption of the system and the shame on the media.
Doc, there's gambling in that casino.
And shame on the system for allowing those that make the rules about themselves. Our legislators shouldn't be able to make the rules about themselves. There should be a way to get around that.
The way you can do it in the states like Iowa, for example, have a little bit different way of doing it. But the way you get around it, I would think, is you have a blue ribbon commission, and you have the blue ribbon commission essentially be people who are as nonpartisan as you can take. But obviously, if they're completely nonpartisan, do you really want them involved in the political system if they have no interest in politics? That's like kind of the catch-22 here. But they would somehow try to make the lines in as bipartisan, non-ideological, and uncolored way as possible. But obviously, when you're dealing with human beings have ideological proclivities, even if subconsciously, and somehow one party is going to benefit. But when you have states that have overwhelming majorities in one party or another, they're going to obviously they have the reins, and they're going to do everything they possibly can to benefit their own political party.
Yeah. It's also sad that people it's party over everything. Party over character, party over actual issues, party.
Well, I think actually it's interesting because I think that's true for members of Congress that have been there for a long period of time, particularly center left, center right. I actually think when it comes to members of the Freedom Caucus, for example, which is the most conservative faction of the Republican Party, they're not interested in the Republican Party. And this was the same for the Tea Party movement that came out of 2010 in opposition to the Obama healthcare plan and the bank bailouts. They're interested in ideology. And I think that they would say a lot of them, if you ask them about the Republican Party, they say, the Republican Party, they're all a bunch of rhinos. They spend too much money. The Republican and the Democratic parties, they're all the same. But I think they would essentially identify as a conservative if you asked them first, and probably a Republican second. Some of them, I'm not talking about actual politicians, but some registered voters may even be independents because they say, well, I don't like the idea of there being a political party and they're all the same and everything else. But the people that really care about the parties themselves, the Republican and the Democratic Party, are usually members of the establishment who have been there for a long period of time, like a Chuck Schumer or a Mitch McConnell or a John Thune, that type of thing.
All right, let's get into some of the issues where the left and the right agree. One is Ukraine, and I'm surprised about this. I can see where liberal folks would say, well, war is bad, and actually, there are some surprises in there. The young people who are against Ukraine have been led to believe in this sort of conspiracy theory that the U.S. was actually was being aggressive, and they weren't. On the other hand, I think that's wrong. On the other hand, you have the Freedom Caucus type of folks saying we don't want to be involved because this, look at that, $5 billion here. I looked at the numbers the other day. Some of the assistance packages were $5 billion, $3 billion, $2 billion, and they don't want to spend the money. But I'm surprised about that too, because as you know, war is good business, and if they're objecting on economic grounds, I'm surprised about that. It's World War II that launched the U.S. into the prosperity of the 50s, and these assistance packages include, well, I should say, we're selling stuff to other countries. We sell our F-35s. We sell our HIMARS. We sell this stuff to other places. Yes, we do give assistance, but in the end, it's jobs for Americans, and it's business. And I'm surprised that these Freedom Caucus folks are against it economically. So straighten me out.
Well, first of all, it's interesting. You talk about the military-industrial complex. Vermont, one of the most liberal states in the country now, had Bernie Sanders, at the time Congressman Welch, and Pat Leahy very much in favor of bringing military equipment, for example, F-15s, to Vermont, because they benefit the state. And obviously, nationally, they would talk about the military-industrial complex. So all politics is local in a certain respect, and the fact that General Electric, for example, decide they're going to make one piece of equipment in one district and another. Therefore, all these Congress people are essentially dependent on those jobs, and it is their job to try to preserve jobs in their own states and districts. So you can't really necessarily actually fault them for that.
That's how you do it. You guys make the small arms. You guys make the bullets for the small arms. You guys make the artillery shells this size. You guys make them this size. You make the HIMARS. You make the missiles. You make that's enough to go around for all 50 states, and shut everybody up about it economically. I feel like maybe they're being disingenuous when they say, look at all the money we're spending. It's just a tool to stay in the club.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. They know what they're doing. Everything's not going to be predicated go to one state. They want to put them in as many states as possible, and they want to have a congressman who is dependent on their constituents and their constituents' jobs. And despite what they might do military, if it's, for example, a backup engine or something to that effect, they're going to say, well, we really need competition between the two engines. And I don't care how liberal or how conservative the congressman is. When they do redistricting commissions, when they try to restructure the military, oftentimes it has to be the congressman or the senator from that state or that district that'll say, no, we really need this military base. Why this is important. It is kind of their job. But in terms of the opposition to the war, I think a lot of the opposition, partly in the left, if you go back to what, for example, someone like Noam Chomsky, a real liberal, was saying in the 90s, he was very much opposed to the idea of NATO expansion. So we bring in countries like Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and the thought process, and I think some on the left and some on the right agree with this as well, is that when the Cold War came to a halt in 1991, supposedly members of George H.W. Bush's administration, including James Baker, promised Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not expand. We'd keep NATO where it is. We would not expand. Some even said, bring in Russia. So essentially, the Clinton administration and the Bush administration brought in countries. There was opposition to it at the time. Folks like Bill Bradley and Gary Hart, who were saying, essentially, you do this, you're going to effectuate another Cold War with the Soviet Union. That's what I think some on the left believe. But also, remember, during the Iraq War, the opposition almost ecumenically came from the left wing. This was a thought. The right wing, with a few exceptions, the kind of Ron Paul libertarian bloodline, were against the Iraq War. But generally speaking, the Republican Party overwhelmingly supported it. The United States Senate, only Lincoln Chafee, who later left the party, and the Republican Party voted against the Iraq War resolution. In the United States Senate, essentially it was split about 50-50 between center-left Democrats who supported it, like John Kerry and John Edwards and Chuck Schumer, and folks like Paul Wellstone and Ted Kennedy and Pat Leahy on the left, who essentially opposed it. But most of those protesters against the Iraq War were people on the left. So it's interesting. We have fast forward to the scenario in 2023, where the war in the Ukraine, the opposition is not only on the left. In fact, there are many people on the left who are actually supportive of the United States role in the Ukraine as long as there are no ground troops. Now there's as much opposition on the right as there is on the left. And this is where the Freedom Caucus and the Progressive Caucus kind of come together. There's an anti-war left, the Noam Chomsky left, I call it, who essentially says that the United States needs to not intervene militarily. And then there's essentially the right who says this is not our war. We cannot afford it. This is Ukraine's problem. We need to spend their money protecting our own border rather than protecting the border between Ukraine and Russia. And there are some that say essentially that, and this is also part of NATO. This is something Pat Buchanan said. This is something Ron Paul said, that maybe the United States should exit stage left and essentially leave NATO, because under NATO laws, if a country like, for example, if a country like Hungary is invaded, is invaded by an outside force, then the United States all of a sudden is at war, and we're at war. It is not our sovereignty. And that's something you hear on the right more. You hear on the left, but you hear more so on the right, is about United States sovereignty. Many were opposed to NAFTA, even though they were unfettered free traders, because they, like Ron Paul, for example, because they essentially said that we're giving up our sovereignty. That we're being part of the World Trade Organization. They said if we're in the World Trade Organization, we are giving up our sovereignty because they can make decisions over us. In the Ukraine, they're saying essentially we could potentially, by staying in NATO, we are giving up our sovereignty because essentially we are obligated under Article 5 treaty, under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, we are obligated to essentially defend countries for what might not actually be our fight. So that's where they...
Yeah, well, we don't get to make the decisions concerning our own well-being. That was a thing with right out of the gate with Roosevelt and that, what was it? What was the first version of NATO? League of Nations or something like that?
That was actually, that's interesting. That actually goes back to Woodrow Wilson. And it was part of his 14 points for peace. And Woodrow Wilson, so the League of Nations, this was a forerunner to the United Nations. Woodrow Wilson went all over the country campaigning for it. And interesting, though, he made a lot of faux pas. One of them was when he was negotiating it, he did not invite Republicans, including Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., the Massachusetts and omnipotent chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee. So consequently, there was no compromise, and Republicans universally just about opposed it. So he went all around the country talking about how this legislation should pass, eventually had a stroke, and the legislation, part of it, his 14 points, League of Nations was established, but the United States did not actually get to join it. In part, there was opposition. In this case, the same thing. There was opposition on the left, but it was on the non-interventionist left, but it was mostly on the right in the idea of giving up the sovereignty.
What I see when it comes to Ukraine are both sides using the issue as a way to beat up the incumbent, not so much based on their ideology or the facts on the ground, but the far left, Biden's not left enough for them, so right. We oppose his Ukraine. The far right, even any right, Biden is a Democrat, so we're going to oppose that policy. It's the same with immigration. The right doesn't really want to solve immigration; they just want the wedge issue. Because as soon as if Biden solved it, or if they solved it, they wouldn't have that hammer over with which to hit the left on the head. That's what I see going on in Ukraine too.
I think that there are ideologues on both sides, and certainly there are ideologues on the left. When Barack Obama invaded Libya to try to essentially eliminate Colonel Gaddafi, there was a lot of opposition to him on the left wing of the Democratic Party, and part of what they said is you do not have congressional authorization to do this.
Yeah.
So I mean, certainly in Kosovo, when Bill Clinton invaded Kosovo in 1999. There was some opposition on the left, and some folks like Paul Wellstone, arguably the most liberal senator, supported it, and he had a big backlash at home, and there were certainly protesters. But in that case, it's interesting. In the case of the 90s, you had 1994 Haiti. Bill Clinton was set to invade, and he sent Sam Nunn, Colin Powell, and Jimmy Carter to make a deal, and they brought Cedras, who essentially had come in an illegal coup, and he agreed to leave the country, and they brought back Aristide. But at the time, you had many people on the right wing, like Jesse Helms, saying essentially there should no blood should be spilled for Haiti. So the right wing became doves. Kosovo in Bosnia in 1995, Kosovo in 1999, you had folks like Tom DeLay saying essentially the same thing. Then obviously 2002, 2003, George W. Bush decides to go into Iraq, and it was folks like Tom DeLay who absolutely spearheaded this, with the help, by the way, of their many Democratic co-efficients, including 23 of them or so, who actually voted in the United States Senate for going into Iraq, and the fact that Hillary Clinton, for example, supported it and John Edwards supported it probably had deleterious effects in 2008 when Barack Obama, who was a lowly state senator from Illinois, said, "I'm not opposed to all wars, I'm opposed to dumb wars," won the nomination in part because he had opposed the war from the start.
Wow. Okay. And just as an observation on Ukraine, you saw Russia for some reason that was getting more and more imperial, and then you get this opportunity, kind of that Putin created himself to bleed them dry,
Mm-hmm.
and both, it behooves both the U.S. and China to weaken them. China is kind of watching and waiting and hoping the whole thing disintegrates, so they can score some of those natural resources, and they can get some of their, like Manchuria, right?
Yep.
As Russian. Is that controlled by Russia? I mean, during their century of shame or whatever it was called, the Chinese lost a lot of their territory and Russia controlled part of it, and they want to get it back. And if Russia goes down and China could say, well, we need to go in there and keep the peace now that there's a civil war in Russia, and they can get some of their territory back
Yeah.
that they lost during the bad old days. It seems it's interesting to see that these powers look like they're just watching Russia self-destruct over the ego of Putin.
It's fascinating. Yep.
Maybe that'll be good in the long run financially, because we won't have to spend so much money protecting ourselves against Russia. Here's a wild thought I brought up to you before, and I know I'm all over the place, but is it Taiwan?
Taiwan, yep.
And maybe we should make a deal with China and say, you know what? Get rid of all the chips there. Give us all the chips on that island, and you can have the island if you fight against, not only don't support Russia, but you actively fight to bring them down. While we're at it, the Wagner Group, mercenaries, why don't we just pay them more than the other guys? Why don't we say, hey, Prigozhin, how much are they paying you? We'll double it, because that's a deal for us.
Interesting.
Jeez.
From a pure geopolitical, cold, calculated standpoint, that would benefit the United States. But obviously, the United States says they have an obligation while they recognize China as mainland China as the actual China. They do say that they have an obligation to support their ally in terms of Taiwan. China obviously would like to take over Taiwan. Would they actually do it by force? I don't know. But it's certainly, that's something that you can hear from the right as well. They would say that essentially that China is not our fight. But that is something that I guess the right and the left do agree on, though. They do agree that China is very much an adversary. Very few people, it used to be, Bill Clinton would talk about the strategic partnership between the United States and China. 2000, the major legislation he got through that year was bringing China into the World Trade Organization. The thought is essentially we can work with China. And you had this scenario at that time. Center right and center left. Bill Clinton was working. You know who he worked with on that? Tom DeLay. Tom DeLay was why is he significant? He was the majority whip, congressman from Houston, Texas, and he led the movement to impeach Bill Clinton in 1998. He led it. Bill Clinton had a 65% job approval rating. Tom DeLay hated Bill Clinton so much that he continued to go through that. But then they met each other at a bill signing ceremony, talking about essentially it was a bill signing ceremony of about adoption. Bill Clinton invited Tom DeLay into the Oval Office and said essentially, I need China to get into the World Trade Organization. The United States must approve this. You're the whip for the Republican Party. I need you to get this passed. And Tom DeLay, an unfettered free trader, very much in favor of this, got this through with Republican votes. They got China into the WTO. And now that's kind of, I think, the consensus on certainly in some part of the American mainstream is perhaps bringing China into the WTO was not the right decision, though I think there are certainly some free traders who would say, yeah, you have to essentially work with China. And in terms of Manchuria, it's interesting you mention that because you can make the argument that World War II did not begin in 1939, but actually began when Germany invaded Poland, but actually began in 1931 when Japan invaded Manchuria.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. What are some of the other issues that right and left agree on?
Yep, that is certainly the main thing. Is certainly military. I think also there's a certain populism. Elizabeth Warren in 2019, who's on the left, introduced her what she called economic patriotism, her economic package. And you know who was laudatory about this?
Matt, no. Josh Hawley, no.
Nope. Tucker
Mitt Romney.
Tucker Carlson.
Oh, really?
Tucker Carlson, and this is interesting. Tucker Carlson represents a very blue collar constituency. Okay, he is not an unfettered Ayn Rand, genuflecting to Ayn Rand, libertarian that just says take the government out of everything. He's actually criticized those. Other folks like Lou Dobbs are the same populism. He's very much on some economic proposals. He's relatively populist, or even dare I say liberal. He said that Americans should, for example, that American government should fight for every job. He's criticized some trade practices. He supported Andrew Young's proposal for a universal income where every American gets $300. He supported that. Tucker Carlson supported that, in part because while Tucker Carlson is conservative on social issues, he's conservative on immigration, he's conservative on affirmative action, he's conservative on abortion, conservative on a lot of other issues. On economic issues, he knows that the bread is buttered with many of his constituents. They're not essentially wealthy Republicans living in Simi Valley, California. There are many of them are blue collar Republicans who rely on government programs. They rely on Social Security. They rely on Medicare. They rely on Medicaid. And Elizabeth Warren comes out, and one thing she says is essentially an American product should be made in America. And Tucker Carlson says, yes, essentially, I agree with that. He said we should protect American jobs. Yes, I agree with that. So this is a point. And on many economic issues, this is why Donald Trump, for example, 2016, him and Mike Huckabee were really the only candidates who were saying we should do nothing to restructure Social Security. And even now, Donald Trump is saying to Republicans, they say who potentially might favor some sort of privatization or even just partial privatization, no, we're going to do nothing about Social Security. We're not going to curtail any sort of benefits, and we're going to do nothing to try to change the structure of Social Security. So many on the right essentially agree with many on the left on that. And in terms of the bank bailouts, interesting, the bank bailouts, if you remember in 2008, when first George W. Bush and then Barack Obama were supporting them, it was this far right and far left coalition. The far left is essentially saying, why should we bail out big bankers? Big bankers are exploitive of their workers. They're exploitive of their depositors. And the far right is essentially saying that's corporate welfare. And corporate welfare is another thing where the far right and the far left oftentimes will agree, and they will take on the leadership of both parties. And another thing sometimes is the idea of legalization of marijuana. Libertarians, a true libertarian would be for the legalization of all drugs. They would say that's a personal choice. But many on the left are saying, essentially, this is something that's hurting black and brown people specifically because it gives a reason just for the cops to essentially arrest. And then as a result, you have mandatory minimums. You have 3 strikes and you're outlaws. And as a result, you have many people spending an inordinate amount of time in jail for minor offenses like marijuana. So this is something where the right and the left, this is something where Bernie Sanders and Rand Paul, for example, in terms of restructuring marijuana law, they are in lockstep on that.
Okay. Anything else that the right and left agree on?
I think that is something. I think generally the corporate welfare is really kind of a great example of this, because the right doesn't like welfare in any form. And the left thinks essentially that if you're going to give welfare, you need to give it to the poor, but you don't need to give it to corporations.
Right.
Accordingly, they really work together. They really work together in that. Of course, we have trade. Of course, we certainly have labor, and I would say also banking regulations. For example, that's one thing. Josh Hawley and Elizabeth Warren are working on legislation that says that if there's another disaster like what recently happened on Silicon Valley, that essentially at the end of the day, the bank cannot award bonuses to their star employees on those last days. They're working together on this. It's absolutely it's kind of a fascinating phenomenon to see the fact that Elizabeth Warren can actually work with Josh Hawley, that Bernie Sanders has worked with Josh Hawley on other things in the past. It's populism. Maybe perhaps there's very little populism in the center. Perot tried it, but usually the populism is on the right and the left. And that's where they sometimes connect.
Another example of corruption is banks that are too big to fail. There should be no such thing with a bank so big that we need corporate welfare to bail them out. There's no need for banks to be that big, and it's corrupt that there are. So to hear you speak, our legislators are not as separated and as at odds as the media would have us believe. That they actually pay attention to some to business, and even when they see somebody on the other side, that's way on the other side, they can work with them if on a particular issue they agree. And that's nice to see with Josh Hawley and Senator Warren on what that was a banking issue, right?
That was a banking issue. And it's interestingly, sometimes, and in terms of the media, I don't point with a bad brush because the media is just a transmission of information. So there are obviously many people that are actually in the media, and some of them, frankly, are fair and some of them are not. But also, you have to, there's another issue sometimes that they work together, and it's when it's not about ideology whatsoever, it's about region. Mm-hmm. For example, something like, fishing regulations. Fishing regulations, they go back to the Magnuson-Stevenson Act, Congress Senator Magnuson of Washington, Senator Stevens of Alaska. And when they're reauthorizing it, sometimes there's opposition to, for example, regulations on overfishing. So somebody, for example, John Tierney, congressman from Massachusetts, worked with Walter Jones, a congressman from North Carolina, in terms of opposing regulations on fishermen. Barney Frank, who has great record in terms of the environmental community. As soon as you bring up the issue of fishing, he immediately talks about environmental wackos. He's used that phrase before. He talks about the fact that he was very much opposed, that he believed that there were too many regulations in terms of, for example, how many times fishermen can actually go out. He questioned the science behind that. He met with the Secretary of Commerce and tried to defend his fishermen. So as a result, he became very popular with some blue-collar conservatives in New Bedford, Massachusetts, a very big fishing port, because he advocated for fishermen, even though you'd think that, he would be more of an environmentalist. But when it came specifically to that issue, he knew that was his district. So sometimes right and left can work together on regional issues. He also worked with John Boehner, the Speaker of the House from Ohio. He worked with John Boehner because they both have GE plants in their congressional districts, and they build the same backup jet engine in both of their districts. So they had to work together to try to preserve that. And interestingly, state like Montana, Steve Daines is the chairman of the Republican Senatorial Campaign Committee. What's their job? Their job is essentially to defeat Democrats. John Tester is running for re-election. He's a Democrat in a state that went 20 points for Donald Trump last time. So Steve Daines and if Republicans want to control the Senate, the biggest avenue is to defeat John Tester in the state of Montana. But you know what? On Montana-related issues, the staffs have to work together. So they sometimes will issue joint press releases, for example, and they have to work together, even though they may not necessarily even like each other. But on Montana issue, right, it's different than national issues.
So you would rather not paint the media with a broad negative brush. I'm going to go ahead and do that more and more. I'm seeing that the media paints things as way worse than they actually are. They will focus on the negative. They will focus on the crazy. They will elevate the crazy to strike fear into you. And as a result of focusing on the crazy, they increase the hate and keep the cycle of ridiculous hate going. And I wish they wouldn't. I don't think they need to do that. Please give me the facts.
I think from a philosophical standpoint, the media is not one great organism that walks down the street by itself.
But it is and let me stop you there just temporarily. They are a great organism bound by one creed, and that is make them afraid.
But I don't think everybody in the media. I don't think you can typecast everybody that is in the media. I think you can say, if you use terms, you say, Fox News or MSNBC, and you're speaking about ideologically leaning media sources. But that doesn't mean that everybody that works there necessarily is in lockstep. There are people in every media organization. I think you have to look at the individual member of the media. Now, obviously, if you're listening to right-wing talk radio, you're in an echo chamber. And there are a lot of people that only listen to right-wing talk radio. On the other side, there are many people on the left that only get their news from liberal sources. And that in those cases, it comes down to marketing. Because as we found out in many respects in terms of the leaked Fox News emails, that many members of and many folks on Fox did not even necessarily like Donald Trump, but they knew that this is essentially how they have to market themselves. And there is a lot of that. And there's certainly that.
Yeah, so and
But
shame
that's
on them
not
for
every.
that.
But that's not. But that's
And
not
that's
everybody.
doing what I'm saying that they do.
But if I
Is,
watch,
hey, we know that that's not true, but we're going to strike fear into you Republicans because we want you to be scared into watching us. So we're going to propagate the lie.
but that's not everybody. And if you watch C-SPAN, for example, I think C-SPAN is about as fair and balanced and equitable as you possibly can get in terms of the people on C-SPAN will come on Washington Journal and they'll read from a newspaper, they'll take calls. But I don't see that much. I don't see as much partisan proclivities. And I don't see as much
right.
sort of an ideological agenda there. I just think you have to, like in
I have to
anything
watch
else,
C-SPAN more and Fox and MSNBC and CNN less.
I think it all comes down to, first of all, it all comes down to who you're listening to in the media. If somebody just gets a degree today, takes their first job working in Presque Isle, Maine, as a reporter,
Presque
probably
Isle. How did that pop up into your head first?
Presque Isle, Maine, because
Why? It just came right like that.
Because I know this. There are 210 markets in the country. It goes from New York City at the top to Glendive, Montana at 210, and Presque Isle is like 205, and it takes up that whole Aroostook County area, and it's amazing that it's a place as small as Presque Isle actually has a television station.
Right.
But they do, but it goes all through that region, and I often think about what it must be like for somebody just out of journalism school to get their first job, and they're in the winter time, and they're going up to Presque Isle, Maine, in 10 degrees below 10 degrees below zero, and they're traveling, 3 hours a day. They have to get back. They have to edit their own thing. I think about what a struggle that must be. Because if you go somewhere, if your first job is in somewhere in, if it's somewhere in the South, you can probably handle that because of the weather or whatnot. But I can't think of any place that has worse weather than Presque Isle, Maine. And I cannot imagine being a 22-year-old kid having to go there for your first job in February.
Okay.
Thank
you for answering that question, how that popped into your head first.
I
did interrupt.
Have you been there? Have you been there?
I've been, I don't know, maybe not. I've gone way the heck up into Maine, like Eastport, Maine, and I'm actually looking to go to the dark sky areas this summer. So I kind of get what you're talking about. But, and my hometown was only 720 people. But that's another thing. Anyway, any other areas where the right and left agree?
I think that's actually something.
We've covered it.
Yeah, I think so. And I would say also sometimes in terms of banking, there was a law that tried to separate commercial banking from regular banking from commercial banking. You had many Republicans and Democrats very much supportive of repealing that law. And frankly, when you want to name a courthouse after somebody, then you get the center right and the center left. And a post office, rather, something to that effect. And usually there's actually a lot of ceremonial pieces of legislation that pass, and they usually pass universally. For example, recognizing somebody, recognizing a sports team, something to that effect. But you really do have to look. You really can't think of bipartisan. I'll just say at the end of this, you can't think of bipartisanship and think, well, the only way to work on bipartisanly is work through the center. Sometimes the coalitions, politics is very strange bedfellows. And accordingly, sometimes you have the far right and the far left, and they really do work together. But it's a matter, if Bernie Sanders had become president, for Bernie Sanders to get legislation passed, perhaps he would have had to have worked with folks like Ted Cruz and Josh Hawley to get legislation passed essentially from the ends, as opposed to working with the inimitable Mitch McConnell to get legislation passed to the center.
I would love it if we get back to the days when during the day legislators fight tooth and nail, and then at night Bernie Sanders slaps Ted Cruz on his paunchy belly and they go out for a cocktail and hang out. I kind of would get, that's the Tip O'Neill thing, the Tip O'Neill Reagan thing. I kind of wish we could get back to that and people could see that, and maybe the population would emulate that. So just other general things.
Yeah, Did
you happen to see, go ahead.
I'll just say very interesting that Barry Goldwater, 1964 Republican nominee, probably the most conservative person ever to win the nomination. And George McGovern, 1972 Democratic nominee, probably the most liberal person ever to win, ever to become the nominee. They were actually just about best friends in person. And interestingly, Jesse Helms, most conservative member, when Hubert Humphrey, very liberal member, came and gave his speech when he was dying of cancer in 1979. They actually, first time ever, they let a member of the United States Senate, remember he had been a vice president, then he went back to the United States Senate. They let him speak to a joint session of the United States Congress, and he's going by, and he sees Jesse Helms, and Jesse Helms looks at him, hugs him, and says, "I love you." And I keep on thinking, when I think of that, I think of, can you imagine a scenario where Marjorie Taylor Greene is walking through the House chamber, and AOC comes over and says, "I love you"?
That would be wild. I hope that history shows that behaving like Marjorie Taylor Greene is not going to pay off in the long run. I even see AOC moderate herself these days and be a little more statesperson-like. On another subject, just stuff that pops up, and I wish I'd paid more attention to this article, but there's someone in one of these Final Four, I think one of the women's teams, says, "I'm not going to go to the White House unless they give the other team a trophy too," which is that whole soccer, everybody gets a trophy thing that the right and me and I can't stand. Everybody won. That's that grown up now. We can't, everybody should get a trophy at the White House. Come on. Thoughts on that? That makes me, if that moves me to the right for thinking that, then so be it. Come on. What's the point of play? I hate that. Everybody wins. Yeah. We're just going through the motions. Come on.
Maybe the other team could actually go out and buy a trophy. Well, they're not that expensive.
The point is, you win. The point of competition is to compete and win.
Yeah.
At least where I'm at now, it's not just to show up. And I rankle at that. What else has got my goat these days? Oh, I'm starting to feel like Ron DeSantis' flower is starting to wilt already. And it's such a one-trick pony. And it's based on, this is where woke goes to die. And really, maybe it will work in crazy state Florida. It just ain't going to work nationally. Maybe going in and getting the books out that disagree with your point of view is just a little bit much for the American people at large. So, and his showmanship is trite. Yeah, and I kind of agree that the rest of the country should bear the burden for immigration, but that kind of backfired to me. It's like, yeah, okay, you're like a little boy in the Sandlot. Your Sandlot is Florida, and it's just not going to fly nationally. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, Florida is not Mississippi. Florida is actually very much a swing state. It's a state that Bill Clinton won in '96. It's a state that Barack Obama, has won. So Florida is not necessarily a conservative of a state. And he actually has a case to make. He can say, I got elected the first time in Florida by less than 3,200 votes, 32,000 votes. I get reelected with almost 60% of the vote. And he talks about how essentially he wins over people in a swing state. Part of that is because Florida is just getting more conservative. And Marco Rubio, running for reelection to Senate, won by a similar margin. And the Republicans basically control the state of Florida right now. So part of it is the state has just gotten more conservative, but it still has very many liberal areas, including parts of, for example, where government workers are in Tallahassee, and certainly there are moderate parts of Tampa. So it is kind of a microcosm of the country. But the thing with Ron DeSantis, and I think there are members of the media that are trying to make this a binary race, it's going to essentially be Donald Trump versus Ron DeSantis. Well, no, I don't think it is. I think Ron DeSantis could be one of the final contestants, but I think there's going to be a litany of other people, including people we're probably not even thinking of. They're going to somehow rise into that top tier, if you will. The American history is littered with early front runners who had got experience as governors, who the media loved at the beginning, who went nowhere. John Conley, remember John Conley?
From Texas?
Texas, yes, the guy that was in the car with John F. Kennedy. He was supposed to be the great hope, the beginning for the Republican Party. He really sputtered. He landed up winning one delegate, a girl named Ada Mills from Arkansas, and his candidacy went absolutely his candidacy went absolutely nowhere. Tim Pawlenty in the Republican Party at one point, George Will said in 2011, the next president of the United States will either be Barack Obama, Mitt Romney, or Tim Pawlenty. Tim Pawlenty went nowhere in that race. More recently, Governor Jeb Bush from Florida, polls were showing he was a front runner. He went nowhere. 1991, there are polls that showing former California Governor Jerry Brown as an early front runner. Jerry Brown went nowhere. So there is a history, if you will. You can point to a thumbnail sketch of governors of states, often popular governors, who are early front runners who went nowhere. Now, what's the contrary-wise to that? George W. Bush. George W. Bush in 1998 gets reelected with 68% of the vote. Members of the media are saying George W. Bush is the front runner. And what happened with George W. Bush? Well, he faltered. He wins Iowa. He falters in New Hampshire, loses badly to John McCain, but he does come back and he does use the Texas blueprint saying, look, I just got reelected with 68% of the vote in the state of Texas. And then he essentially did win the presidency. But Ron DeSantis, certainly there is much precedent for governors that have gone nowhere.
Didn't George Bush kind of have the machine behind him, though? They decided here's a malleable guy, the Cheney world and neocon world said, we need a guy that will do what we want.
No, the neocons, interestingly, did not like Bush because they didn't like his father, because his father did not, after past Basra, his father did not go in and finish the job in Iraq. And George W. Bush actually did not have the neocon support. He talked about a more humble foreign policy. Most of the neocons were with John McCain in the race.
Really?
Yeah, they're with John McCain. They didn't like Bush. They thought Bush was somebody who only cared about domestic policy, who predicated his presidential campaign on domestic policy, which is largely true. He rarely mentioned foreign policy. Up until 9/11, there was very much an afterthought. George W. Bush came in. He wanted No Child Left Behind to get passed, and he wanted his tax cuts to get passed. He did not have much of a focus on foreign policy. When he did, he talked about how the United States should not be engaged in NATO building. He criticized Bill Clinton in Haiti. So the neocons weren't with him. Who was with him were mostly a lot of benefactors, a lot of wealthy people who had been friends with his father. Part of it was simply name recognition, and polls showed a lot of people thought when you said the name Bush, they thought it was actually the father. But he was somebody who was a popular governor, and they saw him as a popular governor. And what George W. Bush did was similar to what Bill Clinton did. When Bill Clinton ran in 1992, he called himself a new Democrat. He said, we're going to end welfare as we know it. We're going to put 100,000 more police officers on the streets. We tried to co-opt conservative issues. George W. Bush says essentially, we're going to keep the prosperity, which we had throughout the 90s, but we're going to do it with a tax cut. So essentially, that was an election. Bill Clinton had a job approval rating about 68%. Al Gore should have won that by double digits. He was such a weak candidate in that election. George W. Bush, by historical standards, should not have had a chance in the general election because the country was in peace and prosperity. But Al Gore had so many problems in that, one of them running about people versus the powerful, like he's Huey Long, in a time of peace and prosperity, rather than saying continue the prosperity. So the fact that Bush tied that election was really a political masterstroke on the part of Bush and the part on Karl Rove. And the fact that he lived on a ranch, that he bought a ranch a few years before he became president, really helped him because it inoculates him from the criticism that he's just another elitist at the Phillips Academy.
He goes out and clears brush.
Yes.
So it turns out that wouldn't you agree that history shows that George Bush Sr. was correct to simply do the job they went in to do and not try to take out Saddam, because going into Baghdad would have caused all kinds of dead soldiers, both sides. You get in, you get out, Kuwait thing's taken care of, and you don't create a vacuum which makes room for ISIS, which Junior did, and messed things up, cost a lot of money for nothing. And it was bad on every turn, that second war.
And that was the neoconservatives right after the Gulf War. The neoconservatives actually wrote a letter to Bill Clinton, the Project for a New American Century, and they said essentially that the United States needs to go in there and we need to clean out Saddam Hussein. Clinton actually signed the Iraq Liberation Act, which actually, if people forget this, was actually had the United States encourage folks like the Iraqi National Congress and encourage anti-Saddam forces in Iraq. But obviously the question is, once you de-Ba'athify the country, once you dislodge Saddam Hussein, what is the successor state going to be? And for all of Saddam Hussein's foibles and the fact that he's one of the most truculent leaders in the country. He was really an evil man. The fact of the matter is, he was able, basically by fear, to have the Kurds, the Shias, and the Sunnis, three really separate countries, all together. And he did protect his Jewish and his Christian population. And Tariq Aziz, his foreign minister, was actually a Christian, so he did somehow manage to unify that. He did somehow manage to unify that country, and he was a counterweight to Al Qaeda because he was more of a secular leader, and that's why Saddam Hussein absolutely despised him. I mean, that's why rather Osama bin Laden absolutely despised him.
Right. So he was evil, but he was manageable.
Yeah, he was a survivalist. He was interested in living in his palaces in every single territory, having his 269-foot yacht. That's what he cared about. He did not care necessarily about expanding, or for that matter, about making the country into Islamist state. Because while he was personally, at least he said he was a practicing Muslim, he certainly did not. He certainly was not somebody that tried to Islamize his country, and he protected the Jewish populations and the Christian population. Obviously, he was somebody who, he gassed his own people. I mean, I'm not saying good things about Saddam Hussein whatsoever, but in terms of when you go in there and you take him out, you have to figure out what the successor state is going to be, and will the country really greet us as liberators, like folks like Dick Cheney had this weird master narrative ideation that was actually going to happen.
Yeah, we believe that inside every non-democracy is a democracy trying to get out, and that's not necessarily true.
No.
Okay, so that's an hour. So let's call it a day. That's very much fun. I got way off into the weeds, but I don't mind.
No,
you brought me back, which is your job. So thank you very much, Rich Rubino. And show him your book. The book, of course. I should have done it earlier, or just tell him about the book.
Yeah,
it is
the Great American Political Trivia Challenge, political trivia on steroids. Because I moved everything the other day, so I don't have it right here. But that's basically what it was.
Okay, good. Thank you. We'll talk to you hopefully next week. And I don't know what we'll talk about, but you generally think of something, and every time I talk to you, I get a little bit smarter. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Greatly enjoyed it.
Okay, let me end this.